for folks who weren't able to make it today, or have to leave early, things like that. So it's a new endeavor that we're going into. We thank you all for joining us on this Wednesday. I'm really excited to have Steve Smutko talk with us today. He's given our previous webinar for us, and he's got such great information on negotiation and how that plays into our role as mediators that I really appreciate him spending his lunch hour with us today. Just a couple of notes. Hello? Can you hear us? If you're on the phone, please put your phone on mute while Steve's talking, just so we don't have to hear all the background noise. If you have a question, feel free to chime in with that. You can also type in questions through the chat box, and Steve, I'll try to facilitate that part and let you know if any questions are coming up that you might not catch. Okay. And any other questions or issues before we get started, folks? Yep. All right. Well, welcome, Steve.
All right, well, thanks, Lucy. I'll introduce myself. My name is Steve Smutko, and I'm a professor at the University of Wyoming. I inhabit two places at once, but only sit in one. I'm split between the Haub School of Environment and Natural Resources. Some of you know it as ENR. We've now obtained school status, so we use the full name. And I'm also a joint appointment with the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics. And I teach courses in negotiation analysis, and environmental problem solving, and also do work as a pracademic. I spend quite a bit of time working as a third-party neutral on cases involving complex environmental decisions. And so one of the most recent that I was involved in was dealing with air pollution abatement, ozone specifically, in the Upper Green River Basin of Wyoming. And that involved a process that took place over a period of about 9 months with 23 participants at the table. So what Lucy had asked me to present was to take a negotiator's perspective through mediation. And many of us who work as mediators sometimes forget what our participants are doing or involved in or in the middle of as we work hard to try to get them toward some sort of settlement or agreement. And in essence, it's negotiation is what they're doing. And I think to be a good mediator, we have to really fully understand the basics and even the nuances of negotiation. So what I wanted to do today is cover a few things. I want to present and describe what I call an integrative negotiation settlement map. It's a diagram that I think, for me, it explains quite a bit about negotiation and the negotiation process. And then from there, what we'll talk about is address the notion of creating value in a negotiation. And that's really, I think, the critical part. That's what makes integrative negotiation integrative. It is that pursuit of value and enhancing value and creating it through the negotiating process. I want to talk about challenges to value creation, and then present some mediator interventions to help disputing parties create value. I've got some readings that a lot of this came from. Howard Reifa wrote, among other things, two very good books. One is The Art and Science of Negotiation. That's really where this integrative negotiation map comes from, his ideas and the way that he describes them. He also wrote another book, and this is what I teach from. It is Negotiation Analysis, and it's really focused around multi-party collaborative problem solving, a very good book. The second one is Chris Moore's Mediation Process. Now, I use I still have the first edition on my desk. don't have the second edition. I used to, but I lost it. But I think the second edition has some additional information that I think is really pretty good. And then the last book that I would recommend, and this one really focuses around making deals, but it's called 3D Negotiation. Actually, it should be the number 3 rather than the letter, the THREE, by David Lax and James Sabinius, who've written a number of books about negotiation. This is the integrative negotiation settlement map that I'm be presenting. I'm going to talk about it in stages here, but so we're going to build this diagram. Yes.
Or your slides are not advancing. Are they advancing on yours?
They are. I should be on the 4th slide.
All right, that's probably because you were, I put that whiteboard up and you didn't get control back. So
okay.
If you go up, do you have up at the top, does it say content list?
You're going to have to help me where the top is.
At the top of the whiteboard, where the whiteboard and the slide should be?
No, all I see is my slides, but I do see something called Share My View.
All right, that's what you need.
Maybe that's it.
There you go.
All right.
Sorry about that.
Okay. Oh, that's all right. So we're on board, right? Everybody can see the settlement map?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
All right, so what I'll do is I'm going to build this piece by piece. So this really comes out of Howard Reifa and the work that he's done, and in doing the work of actually estimating these maps and for real negotiations. So first, I'm going to start with this idea of gains. So we can think about gains to me. I'll offer this as gains to me and gains to you. So my direction of satisfaction is rightward or east. Your direction of satisfaction is upward or north. And so gains then are the aggregation of benefits that result from negotiation. So that's the combination of both substantive or tangible gains, such as the things that you're negotiating for, dollars, acres, hours, whatever it might be, and intangible gains, respect, sovereignty, authority, whatever those intangible gains are that are accumulated in negotiation. So really it's a measure of the benefits gained through negotiation, and more is better. So that's the direction of satisfaction. The more that we can acquire in negotiation, the better off we are. So each of us wants to move, either I want to move rightward or eastward, and you want to move upward or northward. So now we want to think about a next component in here, are what we are the BATNAs. So we can draw those in. We can call them BATNA or reservation value. So I've got my own BATNA, that's the vertical line, and your BATNA or reservation is the horizontal line. So what it says is that we are not going to settle anywhere below your BATNA or to the left of mine, right? So the BATNA is what we call a reservation value or a no agreement option. So it's that point. I think you're all, if you've studied or done anything in negotiation, you should be familiar with this term, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And it's our walkaway alternative. So if we can't settle above our BATNAs, then we're just not going to continue to negotiate. And these are also comprised of the tangible and intangible benefits, although commonly we identify them as a single tangible value. So my BATNA, in terms of if I'm seeking a salary increase, my BATNA is a job offer somewhere else. So that's tangible. It's identified in dollars. It's very clear. But they really are a combination of both the tangible and intangible as well. And that's sometimes where we run into problems, is it's often difficult for parties to clearly get a hold of what their BATNAs are. So if we don't negotiate, we'll be at this point avoid, ignore. So we have a point in which we can say, well, if we do better than this, then we're doing well in negotiations. So the idea is what we want to try to do is search for alternatives or for outcomes that are better than our joint reservation value. Okay, so the next item on here is the solution possibilities frontier. Now, the solution possibilities frontier is also called the Pareto frontier, it represents the physical boundary of what's possible. So the idea here is that there's something that we're trying to shoot for. We don't know what it is, and in fact, it's unknown to both negotiators, but it's discoverable through the revelation of interests. So what we attempt to do in negotiating is to try to find that frontier and try to get there. Okay, so we don't know what it is. It exists. And the only way that we can get to understand what it is by trading information. So if we look at this, then to finish this graph or to further complete it, we each have different places where there's a maximum feasible value to you and to me. And it's at this point where we call accommodate or compete. So, you know, I could attempt to get my maximum feasible value, and you'd be on your BATNA line, your reservation value. It's a point that we could settle at because it's not below your BATNA, not below your reservation value. But it's a maximization strategy, either by me or by you, to try to get there. So now we have another component, and that's our zone of possible agreement, or ZOPA. Now the ZOPA is, let me click on this, represents all the possible agreements that are as good or better than the BATNAS. Okay, so we can land anywhere in here and come up with an agreement. So as long as we're within the ZOPA, we can settle. So then the idea here is that we have options, right? And so we've got lots of options, and many exist, and some are better than others. Options that land the negotiators on the frontier, on that line, are what we call efficient options, meaning that once you're on that line, one party can't be made better off without the other party being made worse off, meaning that there's got to be a trade once you get to that line. So now what we want to attempt to do here is we start the negotiating process by inventing options, by actually trading or identifying interests, we know that, and inventing options that satisfy those interests of the parties. And once you reach an agreement or initial settlement, see if you can do better. So the idea here is to go northeast by communicating openly, sharing interests, and attempting to improve the options for both parties. And so going northeast then is the act of creating value. It's that idea of integrating versus compromising. So that's really what we want to attempt to do as mediators, is help parties go northeast. So let me back up on this one. So once you're on the frontier, though, the idea of whether you can move either one place or other on the frontier is a difficult proposition. So neither party is really eager to cede gains to the other. And this is the value claiming phase of seeking agreement. Some agreements are fairer than others, and it's that search for fairness that really is that final phase of evaluating options using objective criteria as identified by Fisher and Urey. So now that we've completed the diagram, I want to discuss some specifics about the various components and the challenges of moving northeast. Oh, if there are any questions, so before I go beyond this, are there any questions about what I've just presented or comments? Okay, hearing none, I'll move on. So we think about certain barriers to creating value. One is limiting assumptions about value creation. I teach a negotiation course to undergraduates, and we have, in the first class, what we do is a really brief negotiation to get people to sort of think about and reveal how they tend to negotiate, what they've learned prior to coming to this course. And the idea is they really do focus around power and trying to negotiate with power, whatever power they may have, they attempt to exert it. And so the negotiations really are focused around power and rights versus interests. So they're not seen as it's not a I guess a natural thing for people to really think about integrative negotiation. There are also strategic issues that we have to deal with, particularly with respect to what you're able to disclose in a negotiation. Psychological barriers, there's lots of psychological barriers that prevent us from being good negotiators and creating values. Creating value, and there's some really interesting work about that. One of those is overconfidence. There's lots of things that keep us back from actually being successful negotiators. And then those structural barriers that make it difficult too. So now I want to dig in deeper.
This is Lucy.
Hi, Lucy.
Sorry, real quick question about the psychological barriers. So would that, an example of that be that I just have a really strong belief that my BATNA is better than anything that is going to come out of it? I mean, is that the overconfidence that you are referring to?
Yeah, so overconfidence meaning that people are typically confident in the information that they provide is going to be meaningful to the other side, that it's going to be persuasive. We also have psychological barriers. A gain to you, even though it's not a loss to me, is sometimes hard to swallow. So I'm not going to be very integrative or integrative, mainly because I don't want to see you gain, even though I'm not losing anything.
Sure.
That's another psychological barrier.
Oh, I can see that a lot in the mediation.
Oh yeah.
When they're in that level of conflict, that anything good that's going to happen to you, even if it's not doesn't harm me, I'm not going to be in favor of. So.
Exactly. There's a really good paper in the Negotiation Journal by a guy by the name of Say, I can't remember his first name, T-S-A-Y, and Baserman, that does a really good review of all of those psychological barriers. So let's talk about BATNAS. So BATNA represents the negotiator's resistance point. It's the lowest I'm going to go in order to settle, right? That's the way we talk about it. But sometimes BATNAs are difficult for parties to estimate. Sometimes it surprises me how many people engage in negotiation without really understanding what their alternatives to negotiation are. They're usually vaguely identified and typically not acted on. So parties, generally speaking, really aren't aware of their BATNA as they walk into a negotiation. Some parties' BATNAs are extremely weak or basically non-existent. They're WATNAs, the worst alternatives to negotiated agreements. And, so if there's a disparity in strength of BATNAs, that can lead to very much a competitive type of situation. And then lastly, parties may focus on BATNAs as leverage, so trying to convince the other party that they have a stronger BATNA and that the other party's BATNA is weak. And so the discussion really is centered around the power differential in terms of BATNAs. So problems with the ZOPA, the Zone of Possible Agreement. So the focus in integrative or integrative negotiation is to expand the ZOPA through an accurate joint estimation of the solution possibilities frontier. So remember, I talked about what we're trying to do is trade information in order to discover what that frontier is. We don't know it until we share information. So sometimes a ZOPA is unknown unless parties reveal their bottom lines, but parties are anathema. They really don't want to reveal their bottom line, particularly if they feel that they can get taken. In competitive negotiation, parties attempt to convince others that the ZOPA, the Zone of Possible Agreement, is smaller than it actually is, meaning that I'm going to try to present to you, I have no room to maneuver here. I mean, that's what we normally hear in a position-based negotiation, in which may not really be true. Interests. So interests by parties may not be readily apparent to the parties. So this is another thing that is I find that we need to spend time on as mediators, is to help parties really understand what interests are and to begin to identify them. Parties may be so focused on their position that their interests can't be separated from it, meaning that, and I'm sure you've heard this from disputants who are so focused on that position that is their interest. That's all they want. That's all that they can think about, and it's difficult to sort of pull them back from that. When you ask them why, they just can't say anything other than to repeat their position. Strategic behavior can lead parties to conceal their interests or misrepresent them. And then revelation of interest could be subsumed by a focus on rights or power by the parties, meaning that they're really not interested in talking about interest. Really what they want to focus on is their own rights or their own power in that negotiation situation. If we talk about options, the difficulties in identifying options is parties tend to search for a single solution rather than brainstorming several options. They may be unwilling to let go of their stated position in order to think about other options. Sometimes it's difficult to separate generating from deciding. We all know that the step option generation really has to be separated from the deciding phase in order to really do a good job of brainstorming. And sometimes it's difficult to suspend that premature judgment of suggested options. So those are the difficulties around option generation. Any questions on that before I move on to the next part of our discussion, and that's mediator interventions? Questions or comments? And I think we'll have time for discussion on the last part, probably the last 10 slides. All right, so I'll go ahead and move on. So I want to talk about discussing BATNAS. So things that we can do to get parties to think about BATNAS. Understanding that joint reservation values represent the values that to each party if no negotiation occurs, meaning that if we can talk to people about the idea that this negotiation really is a search for something better, that it's a discovery process, and that they don't have to really participate if they discover that they can't get what they need through negotiation in a way that's better than their best alternative to a negotiation. And just by saying that to some parties eases the tension a little bit, just describing this as a discovery process. I'm hearing some thunder or something in the background. I don't know if that's my mic or not, but I'll continue. Successful negotiations should result in at least one party being made better off as compared to the reservation value or BATNA. So BATNAs or reservation values or resistance points are not usually discussable. So if I'm negotiating the sale price of a house, I am not going to tell the buyer what I'm willing to take. I'll let that person try to discover that. So oftentimes when we think about BATNAs as simply a dollar value or something like that, upon which the negotiation hinges, it's not a good idea to actually discuss them. The parties aren't going to engage in that conversation. Sometimes a discussion of BATNAs can be fruitful if all parties BATNAs are WATNAs. Okay, so what do I mean by that? A good example is I was involved in a multi-party negotiation around how an electric company who had a series of dams, how they were going to license those dams, what the conditions in terms of those licenses would be. So it enabled stakeholders to come in and talk about flows coming out of the dams for rafting and canoeing and fishing, flows for aquatic habitat restoration, all kinds of things other than electrical generation. So everybody knew going in that they had an alternative to negotiation. They could negotiate with the power company, or they could try to work through the NEPA process of public hearings, etc., to try to get their needs met. So we had a frank discussion about a party's BATNAS and what that meant, meaning you could come to the table and negotiate, or you could wait and go to the public hearings in a couple of years once those were held by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So an understanding of that BATNA was critical for parties to engage, and they understood that they all pretty much had the same BATNA. Yes.
Steve, you have a question there in the chat box, if you can see that.
Yeah, so BATNAs aren't discussable. How are they identified? Or do they naturally evolve or get to a point when discussion seems to stop? Well, if they're not discussable, then there are things that we have to think about and talk about other things other than those BATNAs. So if it is the bottom line, then basically the focus is on interests. So how can we satisfy those interests? So we just move away from the discussion of BATNAs. It's helpful to have a discussion of BATNAs if it's possible, because what that does is it clarifies some things for the negotiators, and that is, okay, you know, what's to the left of me that I can't exceed, or below me that I can't exceed? How do we, you know, what is the shape of this this ZOPA? So it's helpful to understand BATNAs, but not often do we have that opportunity. Would a discussion of a hypothetical BATNA be helpful? Yes, I think in some cases we can talk about potential BATNAs without actually naming them, and I think a mediator, that's a good strategy for a mediator, just to lay it out there that, particularly for parties who really don't understand the idea that, you know, if we can't meet someone's BATNA, that they'll not continue that negotiation. So a discussion about hypothetical BATNAs, I think, is a really good strategy, just to enforce the idea that, yeah, that we all have our walkaway alternatives, that if we can't meet them, you know, we're done here at the negotiating table. So good point. All right, so now I want to talk about uncovering interest, and I think, you know, if you're an experienced mediator, this is pretty much your job. And what takes most of the time during this discussion, and it is, to me, it is the most important component of a mediated process, and that's uncovering those interests. So what we can do is help parties increase their awareness of the importance of interests. So one way to do that is to say something such as, interests are what's important to each of you. Our objective will be to find a solution that satisfies as many of your interests as possible, something like that language. I often, if I'm doing a multi-party negotiation, I'll do a brief teach-in on the fundamentals of integrative negotiation. So what are interests, what are BATNAs, all of that, so that parties have an understanding of what they're doing, and better informed parties are better negotiators, generally. Ways to uncover interests, I've got two of them here. One is testing, so certainly we can listen to party statements and then feed back the interest that you hear, so that what you're doing is, instead of parties and having the parties state their interests, have them communicate and then pick those out and test them with those parties. Is this really what you mean? Is this important to you? Another approach is what's called hypothetical modeling, and that's simply presenting a series of hypothetical statements and see if they're satisfactory. Often these are couched in terms of option packages, but we can use hypothetical modeling or hypothetical statements even in the interest identification phase. And then certainly we have, I think, the more common approaches. Certainly as mediators, we ask lots of questions. We move the discussion to one that's interest-oriented, meaning that we might move the parties from a discussion of fairly general interests to more concrete and explicit interests as we move through. Or we can brainstorm interests. I do this quite a bit. I find it to be really useful. It's just that interest brainstorming phase, and then just writing those all down, and people then have a pretty good understanding of what's important to the other parties. Uncovering interest. One of the things that we have to deal with is bluffing. So what we can do is call the bluff. So bluff is a misrepresentation of interest to convince the other party that only a settlement with certain criteria will meet his or her needs, right? So, and if we, as mediators, can kind of begin to see through that bluff through testing or whatever, then we have a choice, right? We can ignore it, or we can either try to persuade or use rationalization methods to try to get the parties to sort of back down on that bluff. So, because we know that bluffs can lead to impasse, and they can be very difficult in a mediated negotiation. So what we can do is try to probe and see if this bluff really is a bluff, and that maybe that party really is misrepresenting the truth. So we can do a number of things through persuasion. We can discuss with the party either jointly or in caucus. Typically this happens in caucus. It depends on your style, but we can talk about the long-term effect that misrepresentation of the truth might have, or we can discuss the potential cost of the other negotiators, of letting the bluff go unchallenged, or we can discuss the cost to the parties if the bluff results in an impasse. So the idea is to try to persuade that party to sort of let go with that. Rationalization is much easier. It's much less direct. So what we try to do there is work with the parties to find a rational, face-saving way out of the bluff without labeling it as a bluff. So, create some logical and plausible argument for a shift in the position of that one party. So we might be able to help them, help that party begin to see the difficulties of maintaining that hard stance through bluffing, and to help that party and the other party begin to see ways out of that. So it's a face-saving method.
Hey, Steve, this is Lucy again. What I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about the bluffing issue, because a lot of the folks that we see in mediation, we get some background information and then we're there for them. We're there with them for a couple of hours. How can we tell if they're bluffing?
Yeah, and that's difficult. I think number one is you have to probe. So if you're finding a disputant being, terribly recalcitrant, just difficult, right? Just not willing to move forward at all. Probing to see if there is any ability to move in there. If you've only got them for a couple of hours, you may never be able to really discern that. So what you might want to just move into is that idea of rationalization, finding another way out of that to give that disputant a way out without losing face, through some plausible argument for a shift in strategy.
Sure. Well, and I can see, sometimes you might be able to, I guess it would also depend on how much background collection you do at the beginning. If you're asking them a lot of questions in the intake and getting some ideas of what their BATNA is and what they have as possible solutions, and then you get in the session and they're not bringing any of that up, then you might be able to think that, yeah, they're bluffing. They told me before that they could do this, this, and this, and now they're. So that might help also. But yeah, okay, thank you.
Good point. Thanks, Some things we can do is thinking about interests. So certainly interests are either mutually exclusive or compatible or mixed. So compatible interests are those that are valued differently by the parties. So they're non-competing interests. So I may value one thing fairly highly. You don't really care about it, so it's easy for you to trade for that interest, right? So those are compatible interests. So the idea here is that if we've got these different types of interests, first the thing that we want to do is focus on getting the parties to accept information about interest. So the idea is not so much to validate it as to accept it. Yes, okay, so you're telling me this is important to you. Okay, I'm hearing you. It's important. Secondly, then, is you do want to focus on and make explicit the compatible interests. So as a mediator, what you're looking for are these interests that are non-competing that you can really get to work on pretty quickly. So find those. And then third, work on mixed or mutually exclusive interests. So there may be ways on these, maybe ways to work around or de-emphasize these mutually exclusive interests, and get the conversation to really focus around those compatible interests. So this idea about dovetailing differences, this comes out of that Lax and Sabinius book. I found this to be helpful. So they talk about this idea of dovetailing interests. Before I do that, I see a question that's popped up. Are having mixed interests as good as having compatible ones? I would say if you had purely compatible interests, that makes things really easy, right? And the parties can sense that. They say, oh, well, I had no idea that this was really what you wanted. I can give that to you. That's an easy thing for me to do. Sort of the mixed, you have to figure out ways in order to make them work. Oftentimes, we're just constrained. There's just not enough money to go around. That's a mutually exclusive interest. But, we might be able to sort of reframe that from dollars to some of the things, we may change that to hours, for example. Or we might talk about medical benefits rather than salary or something like that. So there may be a way to sort of figure out a way to mix them. And that's actually where we get right into this whole idea of dovetailing, because that's really what that means. So the idea about dovetailing is it's one way of taking advantage of these complementary interests. So when one side values one thing highly and the other side can provide it at a relatively low cost, that's really what we're looking for. So that's that idea of compatible interests. And these things, if you can find them, they really do. That's really what becomes the basis of agreements. When you start to find those things, that's when parties realize, oh, okay, we can do this. This will work. Lax and Sabinius talk about these three ways of dovetailing interests. One is are differences in beliefs about the future. And what they mean there is the idea that each of us may be thinking about future occurrences differently. And so one of the things that we need to do in that regard, so as we're talking about potential agreements that affect us in the future, and we each have different visions of what that future might hold, we have to probe first to see if those differences are really differences in belief rather than just what we call information asymmetry. I know something that you don't. But once you know that, then maybe we'll have the same view about the future. So if we do have very different beliefs about what we expect in the future, then maybe what we want to be able to do is build contingent agreements. So if things turn out this way, then our agreement says we'll do X. But if they turn out the other way, then we'll do Y. That's a contingent agreement. And so when we do have parties that have very different views about the future, contingent agreements basically are the way to go. If we think about attitudes about risk, differing attitudes about risk, that simply says, this may not be. So if we come up with this agreement, for example, it'll be fine for you, but man, I could lose a lot of money if things don't really pan out. So if we have differences in perceptions or attitudes about risk, then what we have to do is find ways to shift risk from the more risk-averse to the less risk-averse party. So can we work out agreements taking into account this person's view of, man, I can't be in the position of losing $10,000 if this thing doesn't pan out as we think it will. So then can we shift some of that risk to the other party? Or we might want to be able to shift the risk to those with the greatest influence over the outcome of a particular solution or risk. So if I have more control over some sort of risk in the future than you, maybe I should take most of the risk in that whatever agreement that we come up with. And then a third way to think about this is to distribute gains to compensate for differences in risk, meaning that if it's really risky for you and not so risky for me, maybe you should come out of this with more money than I, right? Because you're on the line for losing some of it. So we may have to, that might be something that we'll negotiate over, okay? Any questions about that? I think even identifying these was really helpful because it provides you with an escape valve for what are typically impasses in negotiation and these ideas about differences and the feeling about the future, feeling about risk, and also attitudes toward time. Attitudes toward time is, if time's on my side, so for example, if we're negotiating something and in which dollars are going to be exchanged, you need money soon, and I don't need money so soon, well, we should take that into consideration and maybe structure the agreement to get you early returns because you need it sooner, and I can wait. All right, so those are the ways that we need to be thinking about structuring agreements based on those differences. Any questions on that? Okay, so I want to move to generating options. So once we've identified those interests, we've really thought about how to dovetail those differences. One of the things that we need to do is be thinking about, all right, how are we going to generate options? It's usually, sometimes it's a fairly easy thing to do. I find option generation to be sort of a release valve for parties once they've sort of gotten over the angst of the difficulties that they think that they're going to face in the negotiation, and they realize that, oh, maybe this isn't so bad, and we can engage in some positive brainstorming. But there are some difficulties sometimes. Number one is the things that we need to do is tie options to issues, meaning that whatever option we're going to generate has to solve the problem that we're trying to deal with. All right? So number one is people have to understand that the options are actually going to solve the thing that they're really dealing with. And we sometimes tend to forget that. We tend to think about, well, let's generate options that satisfy your interests. They have to satisfy the interest and solve the problem. There are a couple of strategies that we can use if option generation becomes problematic. One is what's called fractionating, or just dividing the big problem into smaller problems and then building up from there. So if we can think of the big problem and divide it up into sub-issues, and then we think about options that will satisfy and work for each of those sub-issues, that'll help. Or, and this is what I often do is we'll first settle on agreements and principles. Sort of what are the things that we can all agree on, sort of procedurally, that will help us sort of settle things for now. So we'll agree. We're not going to solve the substantive problem, but we're first going to solve it in such a way we're going to agree on the principles that we should all adhere to once we start getting into the nitty-gritty of the problem. So it's a sort of a two-phase solution. So we find options that will help us agree in principle. Ways of generating options. Certainly brainstorming is one. The other is expansion of the issues, very close to sort of fractionating. So if we're deadlocked on salary, we might want to tie in the cost of living, benefits, insurance, working conditions, etc. Right? So that's expansion of the issues. Log rolling is trading components of differing importance. Sort of, well, I'll give you X if you give me Y. So that's that sort of trading that occurs. And what's called alternation, it's a fancy word for just simply saying that, okay, well, this time we'll satisfy your interest, we'll find options that work for you, and then next time we'll find options that work for me. That means that we're in this for the long haul, and we're going to be coming back. We can think about that as in terms of, I guess going on vacation. This year we'll go to Rome. Next year we'll go camping in the Ozarks. Something like that. We call that alternation. So then we get to final bargaining. That's the act of claiming value. So once we're finally up there on that frontier, really what we're trying to do is go toward incremental convergence. It's that going northeast, those dots and arrows that I had in that diagram. So we can do that through formulas. It's like constructing a puzzle. So we might get the parties to think about, first of all, we need to think about the outside boundary, and then we'll focus on one issue, then another, and we'll build this puzzle piece by piece, block by block, until it finally fit. So that's sort of bargaining. We're going to modify some things, we're going to refine things, we're going to synthesize things as we move along. So that's that discussion that we get involved in as mediators to help the parties sort of knit things together. Or we may engage in procedural approaches. That's where, if the parties are in impasse, we may think about procedural timelines. By next month we've got to get through this phase, or do this one thing, or make agreement on this one thing, or else it's going to be done. And then in August we'll come back and we'll do this one thing. So that's a procedural timeline approach. We might have third-party decision makers that might help us make the final agreements. Or we may go toward what's called arbitrary decision-making procedures, meaning that if you guys can't agree, then it's going to be up to the mayor who's going to make this decision, and we don't know what that decision is going to be. That's an example of an arbitrary decision-making procedure. Okay, and then the idea of post-settlement settlement. As the parties are talking about places that seem comfortable to settle, one of the things that we might want to do as mediators is ask, okay, we're here at this point. You're going to get X, you're going to get Y, but let's do this. Let's see if both of you can be better off by, let's have another round of discussions here and see if there's some other way that we can that you can both be better off. If there isn't, we'll go back to where you getting X and you getting Y. We call that post-settlement settlement. What that does is it helps parties spend the time, and instead of settling inside the frontier, see if they can get to that frontier. And lastly, I think one of the things that we tend to forget is that as mediators, what we're hoping for or striving for, and this is what negotiators are also doing, is striving for that substantive, non-conditional, binding, permanent, comprehensive agreement, which, gosh darn, those are hard to find, right? But, we might be able to settle on procedural, contingent, non-binding, provisional, and partial agreements, and that'll work, right? So we need to be thinking and mindful of that not all agreements are in that left-hand column, and that parties can live with agreements in that right-hand column. All right, and that provides, I think, another release valve for negotiators. And with that, I'll open it up to questions and discussion. I see one coming in. It says, Charlotte says, in mediation, we often hear people saying, it's not the money, it's the principle. That sometimes sounds like a version of a bluff. Can you help unpack and address that position? I think one of the things that we have to be mindful of is that principles really, I think, are oftentimes as powerful as the substantive issues that we think that we're negotiating on. And so, principles really can be talked about. In my view, it's an open invitation to go back and talk about interests. And so to sort of unpack that idea of principle, what does it mean? How do we identify it? And how can we work with it? I find to be a useful approach. Sometimes it doesn't work. Here's a good story. I was working on a negotiation which was over a timber cut, right? And so some people did not want to see a place to get clear cut, And so they were talking about sense of place, and cutting here really violates that sense of place. It's a principle. And the negotiator for the timber company basically said, sense of place. Well, if you can accept my sense of place, I'll accept yours. And he says, my sense of place is I get up at 5 in the morning. I look out over a golf course in my front yard and in the front of my house, and I see that dew on the greens, and I'm in heaven. He says, that's my sense of place. If you can accept my sense of place, I can accept yours, and we don't need to discuss them anymore. So basically what he did was he basically set that aside. And so he realized that we weren't going to ever get past this idea of sense of place and principle, and used that technique to sort of set things aside, set that. So we didn't really have a discussion about principle anymore. I see another question. What interests make up the? Oh, okay. I think this is Sonia's weighing in on, I think, maybe what I was talking about. What interests make up the principle and helps unpack the principle position is right. Any other questions or discussion? I see a couple people typing in.
Steve, while we're waiting for those to come in, I'm thinking about what does the role of, when one of the parties in the negotiation is an agency, or, their regulations and things like that are in play. How do you view the role of those regulations and the rules when you're looking at interests and things like that?
Well, I mean, so rules are rules, right? And so those are typically unalterable. I mean, a rule has to go through a rule-making procedure. Therefore, so they may be, the agency person may say, there's just no way I can do that. Which, I think we can test that and see if that's truly the case, but oftentimes it is. The other thing about agencies that I find to be pretty interesting is that the individuals who are negotiating for the agency have sort of a mix between their own values. It's hard to separate sometimes their own principles and values as a human being from those of their agency. And so one of the things that we want to continually test is, are we hearing from the agency or are we hearing from the individual, particularly when things get a little sticky.
Oh, sorry, I had my phone on mute. I was agreeing with you. I think that's very true, and that's why it's hard in that moment of the mediation and the negotiation to separate those two also.
Uh-huh. Birgit has a question with the sense of place question. What were the interests? I attempted to try to get that. So the sense of place question was, the individual said, cutting here just violates my sense of place. And I said, okay, let's do this. Let's see if we can disaggregate the sense of place. Is it the tree canopy? Is it the streams that are going through this place? Is it the meadows? What is the sense of place? And he basically shut that down and said, there's no way I'm going to even talk about it in that way. It's just sense of place. And then that's when the timber guy sort of moved us away from that. So sometimes you can try to disaggregate that, but oftentimes it's not possible. I see Bill's typing a message. And Lucy, I think we've only got, a couple minutes left. So I'll take this question.
We can go over. I mean, yeah, if you still have questions, it doesn't shut us off. So
okay.
We can go in if you can and if you still have questions.
Okay, well, Bill was just indicating that he needs to say something before we end. So Charlotte states that she's excited about reading the books that I've recommended and incorporating these ideas in negotiating training, that she's planning with new farmers so that they can improve their access to land and credit. And the metaphors that I've used, especially the frontier, is a good fit. Well, that's good. I'm glad I could be helpful in that regard.
Steve, do you have a copy of? Can you share with us a copy of that paper on the psychological stuff. I tried to Google it, and it looks like you have to have a password. But is that something you could share?
I can. And I actually gave a talk on that maybe a couple of years ago, but it wasn't recorded. But I'll send that to you, Lucy.
Okay, perfect.
And I'll do that right away.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? Bill, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I just needed to speak to you about a technical issue when we're done.
Oh, okay. Sounds good. Well, thank you, guys. Thank you, Steve, so much. You gave us a lot to think about, and I think it really fits in well with the mediation strategies that we're trying in all of our own sessions. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us today. Folks, we'll have another one next month. Details will be coming out about that. If you have any suggestions or ideas of things you'd like to see covered, send me an email and we'll add it to our list. So happy Wednesday. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Thanks, Lucy.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.